Thank you so much for joining us today for what I think will be an exciting and wide-ranging discussion about media coverage of politics, but I think perhaps of one individual in particular over the last 5 years and where we go from here. I was going to make a joke about how we would be covering the Harry and Meghan interview, but you never know. We might spend some time on that as well. I am honored to be joined today by Jay Rosen, a professor of journalism at New York University, Maria Bustillos, the founder of one of the most exciting media organizations that's popped up in recent years, Brick House, Gabe Schneider, a journalist and media critic at The Objective, and Matthew Sheffield, the editor and publisher of Flux. I thought I'd start with Jay. Sort of the premise of this conversation is to look at what we can sort of take away from press coverage writ large from the last 5 years. But I was wondering if you thought that that was even a fair premise at all. If the media has learned anything from its coverage starting, its coverage of Donald Trump in particular, starting in 2015, looking back from right now. Oh, Jay, you're on mute.
Sorry, Alex.
It's okay. Everyone can unmute now.
I think plenty of things have been learned and plenty remain to be learned. And how the press is going to come out of this, to me, is like one of the big unknowns. But certainly the American press learned how to deal with falsehood, and not just the scale of the falsehood, but the interwoven politics of lying, and then the effect in the information sphere of actually doing lying. Learning how to cope with that kind of lying was like a struggle that took place over years, right, before behavior changed. But I think the press faced that and is much better at it now, even though it still allows things to get through all the time. And that raises another thing, which is people in journalism learn how to deal with this whole notion of amplification is something that you inevitably do in journalism and in the media business, and starting to look at choices for, should we amplify this? On what grounds do we amplify? Amplify, is that something we do? Amplify, well, we do a lot more than that, but bracketing all of that and making it, and forgive the academicism, contested territory where you have to justify the way that you framed it. I think that was a big achievement. And now the most important achievement, however, occurred after the election. And I've written about this. It's called Two Paths Forward for the American Press. And I think there was a moment there after the vote was in where it wasn't clear what was going to happen, because we had the president attacking the result. And journalists realized that they had to have their own kind of democratic breakthrough, which I believe they had in that period directly after the vote was in, but way before the networks had called it, or way before it became a reality in Washington. There was doubt, and the press had to do something different than it normally does. It had to stand in the way of the big lie. And I think that's like a foundational experience. And so the big question for us is, what does the American press do with this like heritage, this foundational experience it had of participating in an act of resistance against the president and Republican Party's plan? So that's a big moment. So that's one of the things I'm looking for. I think in many ways the press is still vulnerable to attacks on its routines. And to discrediting maneuvers that fail. When you can't win in journalism, you discredit the press, right? That love kind of weakness is very hard for our press to handle. Anyway, there's lots of things learned, lots of things unlearned.
One thing that we had discussed in a earlier moment when we were all together, Maria, you had mentioned something that you thought that January 6th was really a big moment of transition, and that was a moment in which people in the media had kind of woken up to what I think a lot of the people in this room had been saying for quite a long time. And I was wondering if you could expound on that kind of observation.
Well, January 6th to me marked this moment where journalists had to not only deal with things that are identifying for the public that which is, wrong, incorrect, things that are not true and things that are bad. Like what is wrong and what is bad, there's a sort of moral substrate to our work that is ordinarily supposed to be shared within the broader culture. Like everybody basically agrees that something is true or not true or whatever, but like underneath that, there is a basic contract about what is right and wrong. And the events of January 6th threw this into such sharp relief that something so drastically bad, these people were behaving so badly and without any kind of a moral compass, and had absolutely thrown human values as well as political values and all other values completely out the window, and we're looking to actively harm members of Congress, like actually in the halls of government. So everything that those of us who had suspected the worst of the Trump regime I was one of those people. I was like, these people are going to behave extremely badly. They're not going to, take their loss lying down. I was completely, underestimated the extent of it. And so I think the reckoning of this, it's very important that it not be swept under the rug the way that, the Republicans would like. He's the leader of their party, and they now are having to deal with the schism. But I mean, there's a temptation among people in our position to say, well, the worst was avoided, and now we can get on, with the business of how things were before January 6th, but we can't, we mustn't. And that's my basic takeaway from the whole thing, is that this has to be reckoned with.
Matthew, you've written extensively about conservative media's role in this, and I think one of the interesting things that you've argued in the past is this idea, we call it, I guess, sort of like working the refs, but the extent to which the sort of right has pushed mainstream media to, to limit its criticism of Republicans and other right-wing figures. And I wonder, it's again very early, but if those events to you did seem like a turning point in which some news organizations, or maybe even before, that some news organizations started to sort of wake up to the extent to which they had been manipulated by right-wing entities.
I think that to some degree it is true that there were some realizations had, because for the past 50 years or so, the mainstream press has not wanted to believe how radical the conservative movement was. And, there is this thought that, oh, well, once Barry Goldwater, got destroyed in the 1964 election, Republicans learned their lesson. And the answer was that they had not, actually. What the Republican Party has been in this sort of cyclical system where it's ever radicalizing, where you have people who will go and get elected saying that these other people who are currently in office, they're rhinos, Republicans in name only. I'm the true conservative. Vote for me because I'm more extreme than them and I won't sell out. And then fast forward about 10 years, then you've got another crop of people saying, well, those guys are the rhino squishes and I'm the true conservative because I'm more extreme than them. And so vote for me, Republicans. And so you've had this loop, which has repeated itself now about 3 or 4 times since Barry Goldwater came along. And then they've basically also simultaneously eradicated moderate Republicans and liberal Republicans who once, actually did wield some real power in the party. And so now the cycle is still continuing. Now we've got Donald Trump saying, don't give money to the Republican Party, only give it to me. And so there's a temptation, I think, among a lot of the national, correspondents who cover Congress and cover the Capitol, to think that this was only about Trump, that this was just a problem of Trump. And he made everybody, he had this magnetic animal force of his personality and it made them all crazy. But now things are coming back to normal. But as Maria said, they're not.
Gabe,
well, I mean, this is going on since the Reagan years. Sorry. it's been forever, right? It's like, there was an idea of the Republican Party as sharing power, less and less willingly, started with Reagan, where like the flag started being a Republican symbol, and the real Americans were the Republicans, and that tendency just like accelerated, clean through both Bushes and in its apotheosis now with Trump.
Yeah, I think there's an element there too where one aspect for me that stood out in a lot of that coverage, and this may also just be as someone who grew up in the Bush era, was this sense of the media sometimes quietly but often very overtly accepting Republican ideas about who real Americans were, right? And you got a version of this, it's almost cliched to talk about, but in the famous diner journalism stories that were everywhere, that somehow if you could go out and you could parachute into real America and you would come face to face with these people. Now, I do think that the riot at the Capitol did shake this up a little bit, right? Because obviously there were people like the QAnon shaman who look very silly, but also a lot of these people were, whatever, real estate brokers and orthodontists or whatever. They were the people that journalists thought would somehow clarify these moments. But one thing that's still not clear to me is if that sense of there being authentic heartland voters, which always was a cue for white sort of conservative voters, if that shifted. And I was wondering if Gabe had any thoughts about this, in part because I think he's written some of the most perceptive stuff about race in journalism that I've read over the last 2 years, but also as someone who has done work as a Washington correspondent, what the interaction between these two things are, or even if newsrooms are taking them seriously.
I think we're in this moment where I'm seeing a lot of transition from news leadership in legacy newsrooms and in cable newsrooms. And I think when it comes to that sort of farewell tour and those folks that are leaving and perhaps some of the management that they're leaving behind, I don't know that they've learned much. I haven't seen them learn very much when it comes to race and racism, for example. And it's disappointing, but I think it's what we could have expected. I think the question isn't so much, did the media learn anything, right? You can break that up, and I'll just break it up into a binary, right? The leadership at those levels, I don't think they learned much, but I think that the journalists of color or the folks that have been marginalized both as journalists and that have been at the margins of the Trump era policies they knew what was going on early on. Trump was racist from the beginning, even though folks and journalists were told, don't say that, that's not appropriate for you to describe things like that truthfully. And I don't know that the newsroom leadership that is outgoing, the folks that they're preparing to take over, I don't know that they're willing to accept that even now. I still see a lot of pushback for describing that behavior accurately. And I worry that in sort of a post-Trump world, without Trump to be that sort of driving force, because I think some folks had sort of come around to, okay, Trump is racist, let's describe him that way. I worry that post-Trump, now we have, another Republican congressman that's copying Trump, for example. Maybe we don't describe him as racist, is the framework that they're going to come from. And that really concerns me.
Well, and we actually have that happening right now with Paul Gosar, the Arizona Republican. So Steve King, he got bumped from his community assignments in an interview, saying, oh, well, I don't understand this word white nationalism, why it's offensive. What's wrong with being a white nationalist? So he got demoted from his committee assignments for saying that. But Paul Gosar goes and speaks at a racist convention and then endorses them afterwards, after giving some pathetic mealy-mouthed apology, then comes and does coffee with them, and then tweets an image of a video game character sex worker saying America at first is inevitable. And he has faced no repercussions for his, and Kevin McCarthy hasn't said one word, despite being his putative leader.
Yeah, and that episode I think does illustrate a lot of what started to worry me as well, which is that you've got Trump sort of lurking in the shadows, right, firing off these sort of weird quasi press release, quasi tweets, and this used to be there used to be a Pavlovian response from the media to those, but absent that, it seems like there's a real reluctance to to call out anything that's short of the sort of Marjorie Taylor Greene behavior in the same way before, in part because without this towering figure symbolizing this movement of Americans, these people now just seem like individual congressmen to the press, and they I think struggle to cover those people.
Yeah, although it's a fair question going to something Jay had said about amplification, because I think that Marjorie Taylor Greene got too much publicity. I think she didn't deserve to become as notorious as she was, and now she's a hero among the fringe right nationally when most people had never heard of her. So it's in fairness, it is a difficult question to wrestle with.
I think it's getting easier and easier as the Boeberts and the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, show their colors. It's like, I kind of see this as a Palin-like trajectory, where there's a glamour to these outspoken conservative women. They come out holding a gun and whatnot. And I mean, sooner or later, they have to talk about policy and they have to participate, and they become increasingly ridiculous. I mean, I'm seeing that happening already with these two. So I kind of feel like a reckoning is coming for both them and for Gosar, which speaks to the whole issue of what has been learned. There is much less of a sort of imperative among people in our position to give somebody like that the benefit of the doubt, knowing that it can lead to a 1-6, knowing that there is a natural progression to this thing that actually winds up in violence and people getting killed. So it just doesn't look the same way to me as it did before.
Steve, in my work, I keep coming back to this problem in political journalism, which I'm trying to puzzle through myself, but I can put it in a very concise way. We have a two-party system, and one party has chosen an anti-democratic turn. And the question for me as a professor of journalism is, okay, how does a free press stand towards something like that? And how do you know when to intervene or when to, and this is what I see coming up, because whether Trump stays on the sidelines or not, whether any of the soap opera happens, the party has now ingested this political style, and both wings of the party, which is the media bosses and the political machine, benefit from it. And it's been bequeathed from Trump to the party and to the conservative media, both sides of the GOP. And we know it's compatible because if it weren't, we would have a fight within Fox News over primetime itself between wholly different positions, different directions. Once that's my it'll change when Fox News itself comes into conflict with the party and with itself. So far, nothing like that has happened because the party Trumpism has been bequeathed to the GOP.
That happened when they called Arizona.
Yes.
I saw that schism as being, Trump calling Murdoch and demanding that he backtrack on having called Arizona for Biden. That was just really quite startling. And I think that it's going to, those moments are going to continue, right? Because he's being indicted. If Cy Vance comes up with something that will stick, this whole thing is going to be blown out of sky high. It's not going to be possible anymore to pretend that we can both sides anything. If he's convicted.
Well, I would say that, I agree that there were the beginnings of conflict with the Arizona call. And even afterward, as several people on Fox were stating the correct the correct things that, vote by mail totals, of course, were not going to be coming in because they were not allowed to come in. So it was misleading to say that Trump had won. But the problem, what's different now is that Fox is now facing direct pressure on its right flank. and that hasn't happened to it before. And so, they started losing viewers like crazy, and Trump told people to stop watching them. So what might have been a moment where the Fox News, out of market necessity, might have pulled the Republican Party toward the center a bit, they gave up on it because they were losing money. And their advertising dollars have dropped so much that subscriptions are how they make most of their money. But if their audience says, well, I don't like Fox News anymore, and cancels their cable, there goes Fox News, and they're not going to let that happen.
And I think that it's also worth, I think, underlining the key distinction between Fox and its nascent competitors on the right, which is that Fox News has a division that does journalism, right? And I think I think you can say there are a lot of questions about how good that journalism is and the extent to which that journalism, sort of launders the opinion side. But the objection that the audience had was that there were people on Fox who would say things like Joe Biden won, that that these shenanigans in Arizona and Pennsylvania were exactly that. And I think that, one of the things that that the last 6 months have shown is that there's just a sizable audience that wants absolutely none of that, even in the kind of bogus, half-hearted way that Fox does it. And I think I've noticed this. I've been sort of trying to do some reporting on it, but Fox has, I think, also retreated even further from doing even the slightest hint of journalism. That was, again, largely just there to launder their opinion programming before. And that, instead we have these increasingly sort of North Korean-esque dear leader peons on, One American News.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I started off my career in conservative media, so I can say that there is a definite pressure among people who are trying to do legitimate journalism, as who work for right-leaning outlets. There is always this pressure that you have to do whatever Republicans say, that you are their servant, that we're in a high-stakes battle with the left, and the progressives are trying to destroy America. They are trying to enslave Christians. They're trying to outlaw Christianity. They're trying to overrun the country with immigrants. We can't afford your neutrality in this. And so, and that pressure has been there from the very beginning of conservative media. Like, National Review was founded because they believed, William F. Buckley and his friends believed, that Dwight Eisenhower was a rhino, and that he needed to be stopped and defeated when he ran for re-election. That's why National Review got started. And so many other conservative media organizations are, they were founded with direct propaganda purposes. So like the Daily Wire, which, Ben Shapiro is ahead of that was financed and created by Ted Cruz's top political donors, the Wilkes brothers. They created the Daily Wire to propagandize on his behalf in 2016 to get him the Republican nomination. And, the Washington Times, created by the Unification Church. You've got the Epic Times, which is run by Falun Gong. Like so many of these organizations are explicit propaganda operations. And so and Fox News was, one of the very, very few that wasn't explicitly beholden to, stakeholders with direct financial interest and ideological interest in doing things. And so it's kind of succumbing to the pressures that everybody else was under.
Yeah, Jay, I'm interested in Jay's thoughts about this, just because I've been reading him on Fox for so long, and I think where that network in particular is headed after the Arizona fiasco is very interesting.
Sorry, which network?
Fox News. Excuse me. Yeah, just Fox News on if you think that how fraught Fox's path is post whatever you want to say. I guess I would say post the Arizona call in November.
Oh, I think it's in a battle between different styles of being Fox, where you have to start thinking of it as more demand driven versus sort of personality or editorial driven. And I think Fox goes in and out of periods when it is either allowing or cannot prevent itself from just becoming an amplifier of its audience's demand. And so it succumbs and becomes very demand driven. And that means if there's demand for this thing to be true, even though it's false, fuck it. Demand must be served, right? So there's a very large, so I look at different periods of Fox at different periods when either individuals, like in the case of Founder, right, with powerful personalities, or industry trends, or the audience is really in charge of what's happening night by night. And I think they're going into a more audience-driven time because leadership is panicking and they want to retain that connection. That's the general read I have of what's happening today.
Yeah. Well, I think the paradox is that since the death of Roger Ailes, they've gone further to the right. So Roger Ailes was a moderating influence on Fox News. Who knew?
Oh, well,
Gabe,
it kind of
is your,
seems like.
oh, go ahead, Maria.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wonder what you think about I think I think you're right, but they've manifested this in a sort of safe way of trivializing their coverage. Like you just have kind of Tucker Carlson going on and on about cancel culture. I mean, it's just pathetic. It's just not a real thing, but it's safe. They can, get everybody up in a lather about like cancellation without like having to answer to any real sort of journalistic standards or questions or anything. It's just pure fulmination. And I mean, maybe that'll work for a while, but I just can't imagine that anybody will, the audience won't get bored eventually. They're just going to gossip.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that I've been writing about this some, but when you look back at Fox's coverage in the early Obama day or months, it was always driven by bad faith arguments about whatever the deficit, the apocalypse that was coming. It was going to wipe out, your children and grandchildren's future. But it was still at least ostensibly policy related, right? And it was still somewhat connected to something that you could point back to, 40 years earlier within the Republican Party that gave it some degree of credibility. But over the last 40 days, what we've been dealing with is, an entire conservative media ecosystem, not just Fox, that wants to talk about Mr. Potato Head's junk, and Dr. Seuss. And these are stupid arguments, but they also, I think, raise this other issue of what happens when you have both the Republican Party and conservative media that just abandoned any discussion of policy at all in favor of these kind of very nebulous, it's like nailing Jello to the wall, these culture war issues. And yeah, I was wondering, Gabe, if you had any thoughts, particularly as someone who had done a lot of reporting in this area, or not necessarily in this area, but just reporting in general, on what you do when Republicans are just not talking policy at all.
Yeah, I mean, you said the word right, nebulous. It's the cancel culture discussion has just become more and more and more nebulous until we've gotten to a point where we're talking about, Dr. Seuss's estate calling back books, and conservative media and a couple politicians framing that as like Joe Biden has canceled Dr. Seuss. And it's so far removed from the reality, from any conception of cancel culture. From, a couple months ago, we were talking about, David Shore was fired from his job, and that's cancel culture in the Harper's letter. And we've just shifted so far from that to this idea that, and it's the trend that we've been on for a while. I mean, you saw it at the RNC. Anything is cancel culture, and that sort of nebulous definition is something that I think conservative media has thrived on, and just sort of blames the left and sees what sticks. And it's incredibly frustrating to watch. And I don't think it's just limited to outlets like Fox, right? Like the Harper's letter, you have sort of center-right folks laundering the same thing, where it's just like a nebulous discussion of cancel culture without really defining what it is and having it stick to anything that they want. Seemingly, I think in the case of the Harper's letter, to sort of avoid discussion of the fact that, yes, someone that signed the letter doesn't like trans people, right? Like that's the thing that they're laundering in that. But it's incredibly frustrating to see the discussion on cancel culture and people's unwillingness to actually define what it means, what they're talking about, and why they keep talking about it.
I think there's one part of it that's eminently clear, that they are conflating, the right to say whatever you want with the right to an audience, to be taken seriously. And I mean, they don't have the latter thing. David Roth and I had a big long conversation about how, guess what? Like, our freedom of speech is like, you're lame, like, we get to say that. That's freedom. That's my freedom of speech. Like, deal with it, And I think that there's an unwillingness, because before there was all this politeness that they could count on. We'd be polite, you could say that these center-right people could say the most idiotic things, and it's like, oh, well, they go ahead. Everybody have his opinion. It's kind of like, no, this is now stupid. This is very stupid what you're saying. They don't want to hear that, but it is, so they have to.
Yeah, the only place that kind of discourse happens now is on the roundtable on Meet the Press, unfortunately. But sort of weird vestige. I mean, one thing that has stood out about this conversation to me is that unlike, I think, frankly, a lot of other similarly bogus culture war issues, unlike certainly the early saber rattling against the Obama stimulus, and then definitely Obamacare, the sort of mainstream outlets, even those that take all of their cues just from partisan talking points, I'm thinking in particular of Meet the Press here, have actually largely kept these kind of cultural conversations to the side in a way that is, to me at least, like fairly heartening. Now that may just be that it's too embarrassing to talk about, that Mr. Potato Head is too dumb, and eventually these people will hit on something that that can be laundered into a legitimate political talking point. But and maybe I'm being too optimistic here, which would be surprising, but I do, I am somewhat heartened by the fact that these early cultural fulminations on the right have been, I think, taken less seriously than they have in the past.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's worth noting that conservatives invented canceling people. Like, that's the thing to remember, because again, it was Dwight Eisenhower. They were trying to cancel Dwight Eisenhower. They were trying to cancel Jacob Javits, who was a Republican from New York, and so like that's their entire history, is trying to expunge and I mean, the very word Republican in name only means you cannot be, you're not allowed to be a Republican unless you're a right winger. You can't be a moderate or a liberal. So it's worth pointing that out. But then also, they've been doing this for 50 years. Like, you used to call it political correctness, and talk about how they were against political correctness. And, and then when you look at successful Republican presidential campaigns, they're not remembered for their policy criticisms of Democrats. They're remembered that, Michael Dukakis, he rode in a tank. And John Kerry, he went in that funny bunny suit in the pipe, and then we had and then he went windsurfing, and then Hillary Clinton had her emails. So that's been, the MO has been that way for the entire history of the conservative movement. And honestly, that for me was, once I realized that was kind of the beginning of the end for my time in conservatism, because I actually started noticing that no one was ever responding to progressive criticisms of conservatives. So I thought, well, I'm going to start looking at some of the things they say, and I'm going to respond back to them. And then lo and behold, once I started doing that, I thought, holy shit, they're right. They're right about this, they're right about that. Oh no, what will I do? And so, and so basically, this cancel culture crap is essentially a way of saying it's demanding political inclusion without having any merits to it. So we deserve to have a seat at the table, but we don't have anything to say other than that, we like these racist Dr. Seuss pictures and that we want Mr. Potato Head to have a penis. Like, you don't deserve a place at the table if that's what you're going to talk about. If all you're going to say is, I deserve the seat at the table, and that's all you're going to say, well, then, you know what? Why are we talking to you?
Here's a very practical thing I'm looking at, Alex. I think the political press is going to be faced with a choice as we get nearer to the next election. And the choice could be between organizations or within the organization, is between covering the next election and defending it in the sense of urgency about known attempts to limit the franchise, make voting harder, make it harder to understand who's making voting harder, cloud of dust tactics as well, that are one party's commitment at this point. And so does journalism look at that as an object to be described, or is that a tendency to be overruled, to be opposed? And I think what's going to happen, I hope, is a creative mix of different kinds of answers. And I think there's little signs that it's starting to happen. For example, the voting beat is now a beat. It's like a really important, it's like a Justice Department level beat, but it doesn't have anything to do with buildings in Washington, right? It's the struggle for the vote. Well, that's a big story, and it's going on now, right? So for me in political journalism, it's like, how much do we have to defend democracy in order to do journalism, and how much can we stand back and say, democracy, this is what's going on, right? And I don't know the answer to that question, but that's what I'm looking at.
Gerrymandering has been this huge problem for 40 years, and now it's revealed, in what the exact cost of it is. So you're so right, Jay. It's now, the cards are on the table. And I also think that you're right that there's not only one approach, but there needs to be a very robust and powerful counterattack, to the threat, which is very real against the free press. And I think that we're seeing evidence that is taking shape, including at TNR and other places. And, there's going to be a range of voices that perceive that threat in different ways and want to counter it in different ways. But I think that the real difference between the thing that we're talking about, the post-Trump press, is a press that understands that threat and is willing to confront it explicitly. And that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, and do you have big lie denialists on your Sunday morning program? Or are they, by policy, not allowed? Let's find out.
Question.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, this idea that you can invite them on the air and I'm going to fact check them and I'm going to, get them really embarrassed. No, you're not, because they're just going to filibuster and they'll say nothing. And then you wasted your entire interview.
That's the status quo, is we'll invite them on, but we'll make sure they hear the tough questions, right? Bingo, it's solved. It's not solved.
No, and in fact, you've actually allowed them to spread their lies when you do that, because, and no matter what you say in the interview, they're not going to accept it. And then their fans are not going to accept it. So what was the point?
It's created this bizarre thing now too, where these people are almost always invited on to discuss something that's unrelated to the election itself, but then there's pressure to ask the question, but it's always at the end of a 7 or 8 minute interview. So you just get this bizarre situation where with 90 seconds to go, then all you do is you listen to them, you say, that's not true once. And then you say, okay, well, thanks for coming on. We'll see you next week.
Did anybody notice this little wave of writings in the press about how the Sunday shows have been kind of overwhelmed by these sorts of tactics, and they don't make sense anymore because you're lining up incommensurate things when you have your balanced profile, right? And it kind of makes the machine go haywire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Oh, I was going to say, I mean, there is, there is such an ingrained, desire for, well, we have to have people from all sides on to talk about a topic. That is what they have been trained to do for their entire, even before they were working. That's what the people who trained them and the people who trained them, that's and things are different, now, and there are consequences to invite. Because I mean, again, like in the old days, before several loops of the conservative radicalization had gone around, you could have, they wouldn't, somebody who was like Paul Gosar would have never been invited onto these programs because they were regarded as a crackpot, insane person, and you're not going to help them. And so it's not, there's a lot more crazy people out there, but you can still not invite them. And the old Tim Russert wasn't going to invite these crazy people on the air when he was the host of Meet the Press. He just wasn't.
Well, I think the Sunday shows are so interesting to me in part because they're like, I think the most perfect symbols of an older way of doing journalism, right? Like they're literally just structured in this way where you have person A on and they say what partisan talking points they care about, and then you've got somebody from the other team on and they say it, and you basically then say, well, how are we supposed to know who's right? The Democrats care about this, the Republicans care about that. The priorities are set for the whole week. That I think just doesn't work at all. And I was wondering if Gabe had any thoughts here as well. Like this is an old model of doing journalism. We call it both sides, whatever. I mean, you see it everywhere. And yet the events, I think, of the last 40 years, but particularly the last 5 have really thrown that into question. And if you see a newer model kind of appearing.
There are definitely newer models where outlets are saying, these are my values and this is how I'm going to approach this. I think Prism is a great outlet that does that, right? I think that there are a number of folks doing that, but I also think that there are a lot of folks still really committed to doing the both sides thing. And it's not just, the Sunday shows, it's also political newsletters in DC, sponsored by Shell at the top, and you have sort of both sides analysis and sort of laundering some of these very viciously racist Republican talking points as, this is just a Republican tactic, and we're just going to frame it as this is what's going on in DC, and this is what's going to happen on the battleground, and it's treated as normal. And it's really frustrating to see that coming from a lot of larger outlets, including legacy outlets.
Well, I cover MSNBC for CJR, and the outcry against Chuck Todd every single week is deafening, on Twitter and everywhere else. It's like, I truly don't understand. And I've asked and I've tried to interview, and, they get stonewalled over there, a lot. And people look at these legacy outlets as like, MSNBC is not a monolith. There's all these never Trumpers there. There's Chuck Todd, and then there's Chris Hayes. And it's just like they're just not in the same universe. There's like a complete lack of uniformity that's similar to what you guys were talking about earlier at Fox, where there's some actual journalists who try to push back and like, well, this isn't true, and then there's these propagandists like Tucker Carlson. Well, I mean, the same thing happens on MSNBC. On the other side, there's like a
Hugh Hewitt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Washington Post columnist Hugh Hewitt. Yeah.
These personalities aren't one of these things is not like the other, like on any one of these outlets. And I think we make a mistake by acting as if you can just say it's like this, because it never is.
I'm with Gabe, and I'd like to see the rise of new kinds of news organizations, news people, news writers, news producers, who put together the credibility in a different way. They start with having a point of view. View from somewhere is the beginning point. It's not something they have to fight for. Their enterprise is founded on it, right? I have a view, and they work hard at communicating to you what that view is, so you'll be prepared, right? So strong point of view combined with high standards of verification, where you have very high standards for proof before you publish in the old-fashioned way, combined with a serious commitment to transparency in which you show what you're doing and why, and you bring people into the process as much as possible, such as publishing the data when you rely on its conclusions, and other episodes like that. If you put those 3 things together, strong point of view, high standards of verification, and brilliant transparency, you've got something that I think people can march into battle with in the journalism waves ahead, and come up with something that was as good as the old objectivity, professional certification, view from nowhere, believe it because we are only in it for the facts. We have no opinions and we have no causes. I think there's both kinds of journalism can be excelled at.
I've enjoyed your writing on this so much over the years about from the view from nowhere is a phrase that you coined a long time ago. And I think it's one of the most important things that's been said in our industry. And to all of this, I would add contextualization, which is like what I think is what is missing the most and has been, in the time that I've been in this profession. It's like there is a real lack of going back and looking at what happened 10 years ago and 25 years ago and 50 years ago, so that you can see these trajectories that like have resulted where we are now. I think it's maybe the most important thing that's missing that I would like to see moving forward.
And that's why press history is really great, because it teaches you there are other possibilities than the ones we're thinking about right now.
Well, and it also lets you know that so much of what you think is news is not. It's tactics that have already been tried. And in many cases, people who have done the exact same things. I mean, like, look at Roger Stone. That guy's been doing the same exact crap for 50 years. And, he was still talked about as if he was a credible person, honest, well, maybe not honest, but like that he actually knew what he was doing and should be taken seriously as anything other than a crackpot. He's been a crackpot from day one. But yeah, I mean, there is still a value, though, I would say, in a just the facts type approach, because, access journalism, while I think that has lots of problems and can make lots of mistakes, it's still the case that if you have antagonized, the Republicans, you're not going to find out anything that they've been up to. And so, but I agree with your point, Jay, that there's room for both kinds of approaches here to journalism.
There will always be reporting situations in which not wanting to piss off either side, because your job is to get quotes from them and remain on friendly terms with them, because that's what your editors expect. Therefore, you're not going to go into battle in that game with your opinions waving around, because you're immediately going to lose access to the other side. So in situations like that, objectivity, yeah, it's like that's how you stay alive. That's anyone can understand those beats. Those beats will always exist on the sports teams, on the political teams. That kind of journalism is a necessity sometimes, but it's not a good journalism to model your news organization around.
No.
Right? That's not what the New Republic would say. The tradition of the New Republic, founded on progress in like creating an informed public. Those are the, anyway. See where I'm going.
Well, and the other thing also is that, because as the Republican Party has gotten more and more extreme, has been this, desperate need for, we have to find reasonable Republicans. And, sometimes maybe you don't need to, maybe you just need to have people who are independent journalists who, say what they think and are not trying to represent, a political opinion or a party or Trump or whoever. Like maybe that's what you should have as your debater instead of, an automaton from a think tank or a hand-selected committee member on the given topic. But you might get something more interesting as a discussion and a debate.
I guess we're running short on time, so I thought I would ask a few questions from the Q&A.
Yes.
I had one, just let it up. Patty asks what the role of local news organizations as a part of what we've been discussing is.
Well, local is where people form an initial attachment to journalism and see that it can add to their lives. And people pick up the habit, right, of following local news. And then when they get a little older and they, for example, own a home or have kids or whatever, they realize the necessity of it. So the people's relationship with journalism starts with their local product. And when that relationship is broken, they are wide open for grabs by all the constellation of forces that we talked about tonight, Alex.
I would add to that, the local understands what's going on when national news organizations that come parachuting in when there's a disaster or a crisis, they don't have the kind of depth of knowledge, and they make all kinds of mistakes that locals don't, because they've been there the entire time and they understand the whole development of these stories. Like we saw this happen in the Proud Boys situation in Washington, when people were giving interviews to far right nationalists without realizing these people's histories, and all the locals were going completely insane. You're not
Right.
paying attention. So I think the most important thing is like the detail that you have from living in a place. We live in communities. We don't live in the whole country at once. We live in our own communities, and we need to strengthen and understand and participate in those. I think it's just really critical that everybody have a relationship locally and in the broader world to the extent that you can.
I think that, and I'll just do a brief thing. I think that there's a lot of innovation going on in the local space. And I think that a lot of outlets, particularly newer nonprofits, are really trying to change the way that folks have a relationship with local news. I think that, for example, the Oakland side in Oakland is a fantastic example of that. City Bureau is a fantastic example of that, where they're hiring people to actually document city council meetings and things of that nature. So I think there's a really interesting things happening at the local level that look nothing like traditional journalism, and that I think should be celebrated, and more folks should tune in, even if you're not from those cities, because I think it's really interesting and important work.
Exactly. That's why I've led a research project that's looked at membership models in news and how membership can be used to sustain serious news organizations, because it brings different kinds of people into the field. And it's possible that member-based organizations, as Maria I know is interested in the same cause I am here, I think of it as kind of like a new way to solve the problem of how do we produce quality journalism, where the people who believe in it fund it and subsidize it for other people who will one day maybe believe in it, but can still use it, just like NPR has always done for years and years. I think there's something to that there, because it's like you have to create a miniature public that wants your journalism first, and then by acts of journalism, make it bigger. I think there's something to that, and I'd love to see it happen. And we've been researching it at NYU in the Membership Puzzle Project for 4 years, because we think it's a big deal.
Maria, do you actually want to talk for just a little bit just about what you're doing at Brickhouse? Just because I think it's really interesting. It's not directly related to some of this, although I think it could be.
I'd love to. It's very much related to the kinds of things we're talking about, insofar as we are trying to create an environment where journalism can be produced outside the parameters of like corporate pressure, and it's a journalist-owned, journalist-operated cooperative. It's completely bootstrapped. There's 9 publications right now, but we built it in such a way as to include a growing number. As it grows, we will like bring more and more organizations in, and the idea is to create a sustainable way for everybody to produce their work. It's completely ad-free. There's no executives. We're just a bunch of people who are ganging up, creating a news organization that is we call it the brick house because it's proof against wolves and it can't be blown down, and we're taking care of it ourselves. And we created a cooperative structure that's very difficult to attack from the outside. I was in the courtroom when the Gawker trial happened, and it kind of changed my perspective on what journalists need to do in order to protect the profession. And so everything that Jay said is what we're trying to do. We're creating an audience, and we're building something that is it's just about journalism. It's not about business.
Everyone should
Love
check it
Brick
out.
House. I love that image, Brick House. It's beautiful.
Sorry. Ooh,
Oh, it's
sorry.
good.
Ooh,
You gotta
Whoa.
Sam, sorry. He's a fan of the brick house. The brick.house. Please come check it out. It's awesome.
It's, I think, one of the most interesting and exciting things that's happened in journalism recently. I think we unfortunately probably only have time for one last question, so I will ask a sort of a big one. Mort asks, do you think the Fairness Doctrine should be reinstated?
Well, I would say the Fairness Doctrine would have never applied to any of this stuff to begin with. So if you were to reinstate it, it would have no effect whatsoever. because the audiences are, you know, there's just not very much news programming that's being made and broadcast on cable, or sorry, on broadcast television and broadcast radio. So, you know, whether there is something else that might be similar to that, that's a question that might be, that's a different question and maybe more one that we should be looking at to answer here, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I'd hope to make it is, I mean, I think the question is really, is there a way to make something like the Fairness Doctrine work within the current media landscape? How about we go with that?
Yeah.
Yes,
Well, I would
get asked that all the time by my readers and the people who follow me on Twitter. Comes up constantly, as a matter of fact.
It does for me too.
Yeah.
In increasing amounts. And I was kind of annoyed by this, because to me, when I knew it, when I first knew it, the Fairness Doctrine was a recipe for both sides journalism. It was, you know, it was a counsel of caution to these stations. And it was boring, and it wasn't a great thing to defend, because it didn't actually work that way. It just forced the broadcasters to take the path of least resistance and have milquetoast people on both sides. If you wanted that, then a return of the Fairness Doctrine would be like, yeah, that would be a good way to go about it. So once you know that, it's really hard for me as an American of a certain age to trust the government to help us like articulate that. So I'm down on the Fairness Doctrine, but other people in my position in academia who study these things say it is actually worth trying to revive. I'm not on that side.
Yeah.
But here's what I want to see, Alex. I would. All right, that's enough. That's my view of Fairness Doctrine.
I want to see more education in the public. Then I want to see like a sort of prescription for how news should be covered. So if we were gonna ask for something, I would ask for money for public schooling, civics education in high schools, and media education in high schools. That would be my preference, in you know, if I could choose.
Well, people ask me about the Fairness Doctrine all the time also. And what I've said for about a year now, and I have been pleasantly surprised that somebody's actually doing it now. And that is, the problem that we have is that we have media outlets that are post-fact and post-policy. And so, but they can only come out of that mode of operation if they're forced to. And there actually is a current mechanism to do that, and it's called lawsuits. And Dominion voting systems and Smartmatic are showing that, in fact, if you force people under legal penalty, they will tell the truth. And so I think that, you know, there's all this money that's being thrown around on different projects among progressive donors and grassroots and whatnot. Well, if you want to see more accountability and correctness and honesty in conservative media, you need to start funding more of these libel suits and these slander suits, because they don't have the facts. And so I would, you know, that's where, if you're going to do something through the government, that's where I would prefer to see it, because at least you can have, you know, each side can have their formal contest of brief and, you know, and all that. So, whereas it's not just a UCAS of an agency or anything like that.
I decided I'm for instead a tax on digital advertising, funding a kind of national resource of reporting that is then added to the nation's bloodstream, and we begin to rebuild the press around some alternative source of funding. And to me, a tax on internet advertising is the fairest and best and most likely to work way of funding the next generation of journalism. I'm not sold on it. That's where I am now in my own thinking, not with the Fairness Doctrine, because I don't trust our political process can deliver any kind of sensible result in regulation. I mean, we can't do the simplest thing like pass a budget, and now we're supposed to master in a dysfunctional government. It's hard for me to see it. On the other hand, there is, when you go back to the original ideas where that gave birth to the Fairness Doctrine. There is a powerful legacy there that has to do with the difference between serving you information and making it possible for you to get your will and action. Both two different conceptions of freedom that are both in there. So it's got a rich history, but in the present circumstances, it's like, to me, it's such a big ask. I can't see it.
Yeah, to Matthew's point, it was such a pleasure watching those lawyers on OAN or wherever it was going like, well, actually, we don't have any proof. As soon as that
Amazing
lawsuit
stuff.
reared its head, what a joy that was.
Those trials are going to be, though, that's what we're going to really need to keep our eye on. The trials could be very revealing.
Yes, there's no question. This is very exciting to watch.
Yeah, well, and the other thing is that, you know, that these types of lawsuits, they don't require legislation to get passed. They don't require any constitutional amendments and whatnot. You know, it's going straight to the source. And so that's why I think, you know, they're not the only answer, but they're part of it, I think.
Well, on that note, I think we'll leave it there. This was a really wonderful conversation. I'd like to thank all of the panelists, and I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us. Visit newrepublic.com, subscribe, follow everyone on Twitter who's here, check out the Brick House, and we appreciate having you. Check in with the New Republic for future events because we've got a lot of them. Thanks so much.